The living room echoed with laughter and arrogance, the kind of sound that fills not just a room, but the air itself, heavy and self-satisfied. Ethan sat at the center of it all, like a king in his court, surrounded by the men he called his friends. They were cut from the same cloth: expensive suits, loud opinions, and an insatiable need to prove themselves in every conversation. They talked about their cars, their investments, their wins. Each story was a competition, each laugh another notch of ego polished to perfection. The scent of whiskey and cigar smoke hung thick, mixing with the faint aroma of roasted meat from the kitchen. The fire crackled softly in the background, almost drowned by the rumbling voices of men who believed success meant dominance. Clara moved through the room quietly, almost invisible. She had grown used to this rhythm: the weekend gatherings, the loud banter, the occasional offhand remark that reminded her she was part of the background, not the story. She refilled glasses without interrupting, smiled when acknowledged, and gathered empty plates with careful precision. Her hands were steady, but her heart wasn't. Every laugh from that group of men, especially Ethan's booming one, felt like a hammer striking something fragile inside her. Yet she kept her face composed, her movements graceful, as though performing in a silent play she never auditioned for. Ethan was in his element. His voice carried effortlessly across the room as he bragged about his latest deal, a contract he claimed he single-handedly negotiated despite knowing a dozen people had done the groundwork. "You've got to show them who's boss," he declared, pointing a ring-adorned finger at his friends. "People respect strength, not sensitivity. That's how you lead." They cheered, raising glasses, the sound of clinking crystal merging with their hollow laughter. Clara stood behind him for a moment, tray in hand, and wondered when exactly he had started mistaking cruelty for confidence. As she bent slightly to collect the empty glasses, her sleeve caught the edge of a half-empty bottle of whiskey. Time seemed to slow. The bottle wobbled, tipped, and crashed to the polished floor. The golden liquid spread quickly across the rug like a dark stain of shame. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Ethan's friends began to murmur, smirking, exchanging glances that said of course. Ethan turned, his jaw tightening, eyes narrowing with irritation that wasn't really about the spill. It was about being embarrassed. "You're useless sometimes, you know that," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. The words weren't shouted, but they landed with more force than any slap could. Laughter erupted again. Not cruel laughter, not exactly. It was the kind of laughter men used to ease tension, to avoid discomfort, to align themselves with a more powerful person in the room. One of them muttered, "It's just a spill, mate." But the damage was done. Clara froze, the tray still in her hand. Her cheeks flushed, but her expression didn't change. She looked down at the spreading whiskey, then at her reflection in the puddle, distorted, faint, almost unrecognizable. She placed the tray down gently, reached for a towel, and began blotting the mess in silence. Ethan, already moving on, tossed a joke to his friends, trying to reclaim his swagger. "Guess I need a maid who can handle top-shelf stuff," he said, smirking. They laughed again, louder this time, grateful for the permission to forget the awkwardness. The room returned to its rhythm, the cards, the bragging, the jokes, but something had shifted quietly, invisibly. Clara finished cleaning, stood up, and glanced around the room one last time. The firelight flickered across their faces, men so consumed with themselves they couldn't see the world burning just inches away. She placed the bottle upright on the table, not saying a word. For a moment, she considered speaking, maybe defending herself, maybe pointing out how ridiculous it was for grown men to act like kings in a rented castle of ego. But she didn't. Words would only bounce off the thick armor of their pride. Instead, she gave a faint nod, her lips barely curving into something that might have been mistaken for a polite smile. Then she turned, walked toward the kitchen, and disappeared behind the door. Ethan didn't notice the way her shoulders stiffened before she left, or how her hand lingered briefly on the doorframe, as though steadying herself against something she couldn't yet name. His friends had already resumed their conversation, moving on to the next boast, the next story, the next round. But inside that kitchen, something began to shift. Clara stood still, her hands gripping the counter, her reflection staring back at her from the dark windowpane. The faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound now, and in that silence, her humiliation turned into clarity. It wasn't about the spilled whiskey or the insult. Not really. It was about every small moment that had led here. The dismissive comments disguised as jokes, the way he took her kindness for weakness, the way he let her fade into the wallpaper of his life. She realized she had been apologizing for existing too softly in a world that rewarded noise. 4 years she'd told herself he would change, that one day he'd remember the woman he fell in love with, the one with dreams, ideas, opinions. But now she saw the truth with painful precision. Ethan didn't forget. He just stopped looking. When she finally returned to the living room, the laughter was louder, looser, sloppier. None of them noticed the subtle difference in her gaze. Calm, detached, resolved. She moved past Ethan, picked up the last glass from the table, and for the first time didn't refill it. He didn't even see her pause behind his chair, watching him bask in his own reflection. She turned off the lights in the hallway, one by one, her footsteps measured, deliberate. By the time Ethan looked up again, she was gone, the kitchen light off, the sound of her steps fading into the distance. "She'll get over it," he said to his friends, shrugging. They nodded, dealt another round of cards, and laughed. But somewhere upstairs, a woman who had once believed silence was her safest armor began to understand its power, not as surrender, but as the calm before transformation. And though Ethan didn't know it yet, that quiet exit from the room wasn't an ending. It was the first move in a story he would never be able to control. That night, after the guests had gone and the laughter faded into echoes, silence crept into the house like an unwelcome guest. The remnants of the evening still lingered. Half-empty glasses on the table, the faint smell of whiskey in the air, and the soft hum of the chandelier above the dining room. Ethan was still basking in the afterglow of attention, proud of the stories he'd told, unaware that what he saw as charm had turned into cruelty long ago. But when he stepped into the living room and saw Clara sitting by the window, that pride wavered for just a second. She was still in her dress, her hair loose, her posture perfectly still. Her face, illuminated by the soft blue glow of her phone, carried a kind of calm that wasn't peace. It was distance. The look of someone who had already left, even if her body remained. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping gently against the glass, but Clara didn't move. She wasn't crying, she hadn't for a long time. There was no point in crying over something that had already been broken for years. She simply stared at her reflection in the window, the faint outline of a woman she no longer recognized, one who had once believed in building a life alongside someone, not underneath them. Ethan cleared his throat, breaking the stillness. "You embarrassed me in front of my friends," he said. His tone defensive, sharp, as if he were the one wronged. It wasn't an apology, it was a reflex. He'd always known how to twist the narrative, so he came out the victim. Clara didn't look up. She didn't even flinch. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet, not weak, but calm in a way that made him uncomfortable. "You embarrassed yourself," she said. Just 4 words. No argument, no tears. Just truth delivered so softly it hurt more than shouting ever could. Ethan scoffed, pacing a little, muttering under his breath about her being overly dramatic, sensitive, ungrateful. The same words he always used when he wanted to end a conversation without admitting fault. "You're making a big deal out of nothing," he said finally, waving his hand dismissively as he started up the stairs. Clara didn't respond. The only sound that followed him was the steady tapping of rain and the faint buzz of her phone in her hand. When he reached the top of the stairs, he paused for a moment, maybe expecting her to say something. A plea, a soft good night. Anything. But none came. And for the first time in years, he realized he didn't know what she was thinking. Downstairs, Clara remained by the window. Her phone screen dimmed, then brightened again as she unlocked it. The clock read 1:37 a.m. Sleep was far from her mind. Her thoughts moved restlessly between anger and clarity, grief and resolve. She scrolled through her contacts, names she hadn't seen in years, lives she'd quietly drifted away from. Old friends, colleagues, People from the version of herself she had once been before her world shrank down to Ethan's moods and expectations. Her thumb stopped on one name that made her breath catch slightly. Margaret Chen. Margaret had been her professor in college, a mentor who saw her potential long before she did. Clara could still remember her words during their last conversation years ago. "You were never meant to stay small." At the time, Clara had smiled politely, thinking it was just encouragement. But now, those words felt like a memory from another life. She hadn't stayed small by accident, she'd been made to. Every time Ethan dismissed her ideas, every time he made her feel like her worth depended on his approval, she had folded herself a little smaller, quieter, safer. Until she almost disappeared entirely. Her finger hovered over the contact name for several seconds. What would she even say after all these years? "Hi, it's me. I don't know who I am anymore." She opened a new email draft instead. The blank page glowed before her, intimidating and inviting all at once. Her fingers trembled slightly as she typed the first line, then deleted it. Tried again, deleted that too. She must have written and erased a dozen versions before realizing the problem wasn't the words. It was the fear. The fear of being seen again, of stepping out from the shadow she'd learned to live inside. Upstairs, Ethan snored lightly, his sleep deep and untroubled, while downstairs, Clara's mind refused to rest. She thought about all the times she had put herself second, all the moments she'd stayed quiet because it was easier than fighting. But tonight the silence felt different. It wasn't submission, it was the quiet before action. The kind of quiet that builds strength instead of erasing it. Her phone buzzed once more, a notification she ignored. The only thing that mattered now was the empty email staring back at her, waiting. Finally, just as dawn began to creep through the curtains, she stopped overthinking. The pale light painted soft gold streaks across the floor, turning the room into a fragile reminder that something new could begin, even here. She exhaled slowly, then typed a single sentence. No explanations, no apologies. Just 7 words that carried the weight of everything she had lost and everything she was ready to reclaim. "I'm ready to work again. Clara." Her finger hovered for a heartbeat before pressing send. The whoosh of the email flying out felt like a door unlocking somewhere deep inside her. She set the phone down and finally leaned back in her chair, eyes closing as the first birds began to sing outside. It wasn't a victory, not yet. It was something quieter, more sacred. The beginning of a life that would no longer revolve around someone else's pride. Upstairs, Ethan stirred in his sleep, unaware that his world had just begun to shift in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Clara watched the light grow stronger, touching the edges of the room. For the first time in years, she didn't feel small. She didn't feel invisible. She felt awake. Fully, dangerously awake. And somewhere in that rising dawn, she knew that the story of her life had just started again. Only this time she would be the one telling it. 2 weeks later, the skyline stretched before her, steel and glass reaching into a cold, brilliant morning. The city pulsed with motion below, cars threading between lanes like veins pumping life into a sleeping giant. Clara stood in a glass office, her reflection blending with the high-rise towers beyond the window. For a moment, she almost didn't recognize herself. Gone was the woman who once waited in silence for someone to notice her worth. In her place stood someone reborn. Cautious, yes, but steady. Live. "Clara," came a voice behind her, warm and familiar. Margaret Chen, elegant as ever, sharp-eyed and grounded, entered the office holding a folder thick with papers. She wore that same smile Clara remembered from college. Confident, knowing, a touch mischievous. "You've still got it," she said, wrapping her in a quick hug before handing her the folder. "I knew you would." Clara smiled, but there was a nervous tremor in her voice. "I hope so," she said quietly, glancing down at the documents. Inside were proposals, client briefs, brand notes, the kind of work that once thrilled her. It had been years since she'd seen anything like it up close. Years since her life had been defined by deadlines, not dinner tables. Margaret studied her for a moment, reading the hesitation that flickered behind her composure. Don't hope, she said, gently but firmly. Do. The office belonged to a communications firm that thrived on precision, strategic storytelling, as the sign on the wall said. It wasn't lost on Clara how fitting that was. She had spent years silencing her own story, learning to fade into the background. Now she was being invited to craft the voices of brands that spoke to millions. Her first few days were quiet, intentionally so. She watched, listened, absorbed. The younger employees, sharp and restless, often underestimated her. To them, she was polite, soft-spoken, perhaps too reserved for the city's pace. But what they didn't see was the depth behind that calm, a mind that had learned to read between words, to notice what others missed. Years of emotional restraint had honed her into something else entirely. Someone who could listen deeply and speak precisely. By the end of the first week, Margaret had begun handing her real assignments. Small projects, mostly. Client social strategy here, a rebranding outline there. But Clara didn't just do the tasks, she transformed them. Her drafts weren't loud or flashy. They were clear, emotionally intelligent, powerful in their simplicity. She wrote the way she used to speak before she was silenced, with grace and conviction. It was during a late evening brainstorming session that her turning point arrived. The firm had been struggling to win over a major brand, a sustainability company with a reputation for rejecting proposals. The room buzzed with exhaustion, half-empty coffee cups and failed ideas scattered across the table. Margaret leaned against the wall, sighing, when Clara spoke up softly. "What if," she said, "we stop selling their product and start telling their purpose?" Heads turned. She stood, nervous but steady, and continued. "Every brand wants to be seen. But what if we make this one heard, through the people they've impacted, the communities they've helped? Instead of telling the world who they are, let's show them through real voices. Story-driven campaign. Not an ad." The room went quiet. Then Margaret smiled slowly. "Go on." Clara outlined her vision. A campaign centered on authenticity, empathy, and trust. It wasn't just creative, it was strategic. Spoke to emotion and logic at once. By the time she finished, even the skeptical senior executives were nodding. Margaret gave a single approving nod. "That's it," she said. 2 weeks later, the firm landed the contract. A massive one. The news spread fast. Whispered compliments, respectful glances, and a sudden shift in tone when Clara entered a room. She didn't gloat, she simply kept working, focused and calm. But every time someone said, "Brilliant idea, Clara," something warm flickered inside her chest. A reminder that she still belonged in the world of ideas, and that she had never truly lost herself. She had only been waiting for the silence to end. Meanwhile at home, the air between her and Ethan began to change. He noticed first in small ways. The mornings when she left early, the evenings she came home late, the faint perfume of confidence that lingered around her. Her words, once tentative, had gained weight. When she spoke, it was measured, decisive. No more second-guessing. No more apologizing for taking up space. One night, as she stood by the mirror fastening her earrings, Ethan leaned against the doorway. "Where are you going?" he asked, the question casual but laced with unease. "To work," she said simply, meeting his gaze in the reflection. Her tone was calm, almost kind, but firm. He frowned. "Again. You've been working a lot lately." She turned to face him fully. "Yes. And I'm good at it." There was no malice in her voice, only fact. But that quiet certainty unsettled him more than anger ever could. For years, he had been the center of gravity in their marriage. Every conversation, every decision revolved around his comfort. Now, for the first time, she was moving according to her own orbit. And he could feel the pull weakening. He tried to mask his discomfort with a smile. "Just don't forget about me when you're running the world, huh?" Clara returned the faintest of smiles. "Don't worry," she said softly, picking up her bag. "The world remembers those who respect it." He didn't understand what she meant. Not yet. But the unease lingered as she walked past him. Heels clicking against the floor, posture straight, head held high. When she reached her car, she paused for a moment before starting the engine. The city lights shimmered across the windshield, reflected like constellations. Somewhere deep inside she felt a calm surge, not of pride but of purpose. This wasn't revenge. Not yet. This was reclamation. A return to the woman she was always meant to be. And as the elevator doors closed behind her the next morning, her reflection caught in the mirrored wall. Confident, composed, quietly radiant, Clara realized something profound. She didn't need Ethan's approval anymore. Or anyone's. For the first time in years, she was exactly where she belonged. A month later, Ethan's world began to tremble, not with thunder but with silence. It started on an ordinary Tuesday morning. The office buzzed with routine energy. Phones ringing, assistants darting between glass-walled rooms, the hum of printers filling the air. Ethan sat at the head of the table during the weekly briefing, half listening as his team updated him on numbers that looked fine. Stable, predictable, safe. He leaned back in his chair, sipping coffee, satisfied that the chaos from last quarter had finally quieted down. For a moment, he believed he still had control. Then his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end was sharp, businesslike. "Mr. Carter. This is Alan Price from the Brigham Group. I wanted to call personally to inform you we're pulling out of our partnership." Ethan frowned, sitting upright. Pulling out? That contract's in final negotiation. We were supposed to close next week. Was. Then calmly the man replied, "We've decided to move in a different direction. Your competitors brought in a new communications firm that actually listens and delivers results." Ethan's pulse quickened. Competitors? Which firm? Vantage Communications, the voice said. They're launching a fresh campaign next quarter. We were impressed by their strategic lead, a woman named Clara Reeves. The words hit like a punch. Ethan's hand tightened around the phone. For a moment he thought he'd misheard. But the name echoed, steady, undeniable. Clara Reeves. The woman he'd laughed at. The woman he'd called useless. He ended the call abruptly, muttering something about needing clarification, then pushed his chair back so suddenly it scraped against the polished floor. "Get me the marketing reports," he barked to his assistant. "All of them. Now." Within minutes, a folder was placed on his desk. Ethan flipped through the documents with shaking hands. Charts, client lists, proposals. And there it was, the press release. His stomach dropped as he read the bold heading. Vantage Communications announces new lead strategist, Clara Reeves. Beneath it, a professional headshot of her. Confident, poised, her eyes steady as ever. The accompanying article described her as a visionary in strategic communication, a woman who believes in authenticity, empathy, and purpose-driven branding. Words like integrity and innovation jumped off the page. There was even a quote attributed to her. "When people feel unheard, they stop trusting. My job is to help brands start listening again." Ethan sank into his chair, his chest heavy. He read the quote twice, then a third time. That line, about listening, pierced deeper than any insult could have. He had spent years not listening to her. Not to her ideas, her warnings, or her silences. And now, the very quality he had dismissed in her, her ability to see what others didn't, had become her greatest strength. By the end of the day, the damage was clear. The Brigham deal was gone, and with it, a chain reaction began. Other clients, catching wind of the switch, started asking questions. "Are you still the right fit for us? We heard your rival's campaign already doubled engagement." It was subtle at first, polite inquiries, small doubts, but in business perception is everything. And once it starts to shift, it spreads like wildfire. That evening, Ethan drove home in silence. The city lights blurred past, neon reflections sliding across his windshield like streaks of accusation. He replayed the phone call again and again in his mind. Her name, her title, the calm certainty of the investor's voice. By the time he reached his driveway, he wasn't angry anymore. He was afraid. Inside, the house was quiet. The same house where he had once laughed with friends, belittled her without consequence, and assumed her silence meant submission. But tonight that silence carried weight. Authority. He found her in the kitchen, casually slicing vegetables, her movements calm and deliberate. There was no triumph in her posture, no smug smile waiting to greet him. Just peace. The kind of peace that comes from finally stepping out of someone's shadow. "You did this on purpose," he said, the accusation trembling at the edge of his voice. Clara looked up. For a long moment she didn't say anything. Then, with measured grace, she set down the knife, wiped her hands on a towel, and met his eyes. "No, Ethan," she said quietly. "I did this because you called me useless, and I believed you for too long." He flinched. Her tone wasn't angry. It wasn't loud. It was calm, the kind of calm that comes after a storm, when the wreckage is undeniable. "You spent years convincing me that my voice didn't matter," she continued, her words slow and deliberate. "And for a while I let you. I made myself smaller so you could feel big. But that's not love, Ethan. That's survival." He stepped closer, desperate, searching her face for any sign of remorse. "So this is revenge, then?" She shook her head. "No. This is clarity." He swallowed hard. "You cost me millions." She gave a faint, almost sorrowful smile. "No, Ethan. You cost yourself that the moment you stopped respecting what was real." The words lingered in the air, heavy and final. She turned back to the counter, continuing her quiet rhythm, the steady chop of the knife against the board, the hiss of the pan heating behind her. He stood there, useless, watching her move with a confidence that made him feel small in his own home. For the first time, he saw her not as his wife, not as the quiet caretaker who blended into the background, but as a woman who had rebuilt herself piece by piece, not to prove him wrong, but to prove herself right. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Her very presence was enough. Ethan stepped back slowly, realizing something deeper than loss, realizing what true power looked like. It wasn't in the loud meetings, the expensive suits, or the fear he used to command. It was in stillness, in certainty, in the quiet conviction of someone who had nothing left to prove. As he stood in the doorway, she finally spoke again, her voice soft, almost kind. "You said people respect control," she murmured. "Maybe they do. But the ones who earn it, they don't need to ask for it." He had no response. The next morning, he woke up alone at the kitchen table, an untouched cup of coffee cooling beside him. The city outside was waking up, cars moving, lives continuing, but for Ethan, everything had gone still. He looked at his reflection in the dark window, and for the first time, he saw not the man who once ruled the room, but the man left behind by his own arrogance. Clara didn't destroy him. She simply stopped saving him. And that, he finally understood, was what true strength looked like. Weeks later, Clara's name had become a quiet storm, the kind that doesn't roar, but reshapes everything it touches. The city's business journals couldn't get enough of her story. "A new voice redefining corporate communication," one headline read. "Empathy as strategy, the woman who changed the game," another declared. Every cover seemed to feature her now. Poised, confident, her gaze direct yet kind, a stark contrast to the noise and arrogance that used to dominate that world. Her campaign had done more than win clients. It had set a new standard. She'd taken what most executives dismissed, listening, sincerity, emotional intelligence, and turned them into weapons sharper than any corporate pitch. Her firm's message was simple: speak with purpose, not volume. And people responded. Clients flocked to her philosophy, journalists admired her grace, and investors lined up to work with someone who made integrity sound like innovation. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan's empire was coming apart thread by thread. What began as a single lost account had spiraled into a slow, merciless unraveling. Clients began to question his methods. The board grew restless. His once vibrant office, with its gleaming glass walls and carefully curated art, now felt colder, emptier. The laughter that used to echo through those rooms had turned to whispers. Whispers about decline, about karma, About how quickly things can change when the people you step on learn how to stand taller than you. He tried to tell himself it was just a phase, that business was cyclical, that the market was unpredictable. But deep down he knew better. It wasn't the market. It wasn't timing. It was Clara. It was the way she had quietly rewritten the rules of the game. Not to beat him, but to remove him entirely from the board. He started reaching out. First an email. Short, polite. Proud of what you've accomplished. Let's talk. No reply. Then another, longer, filled with apologies that sounded more rehearsed than real. Still nothing. Days passed. He sent flowers. A dozen white lilies, the kind she used to keep by the window. The delivery service confirmed they were received, but he never heard back. When he called the firm, the receptionist paused before saying, "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter. Ms. Reeves isn't available." The tone was professional, but the pause was telling. It carried the faint echo of pity. One evening, while scrolling through his phone, Ethan saw a headline on a popular business network. Clara Reeves, how compassion became her competitive edge. His thumb hovered over the video thumbnail before he pressed play. The screen came to life. Her face illuminated beneath studio lights, calm and composed. The interviewer smiled as he asked, "Clara, many see you as a pioneer of a new kind of leadership, one that challenges traditional power structures. What drives you?" She didn't hesitate. Her voice was steady, measured, yet full of quiet conviction. "I think people forget that success isn't about proving someone wrong," she said. "It's about remembering you were right about yourself all along." The audience erupted in applause. Even through the screen, the moment carried weight, not as a sound bite but as truth. Ethan felt it like a knife sliding beneath his ribs. He turned off the TV, but her words lingered in the silence of his living room, refusing to fade. That night, he sat alone at the same dining table where it had all begun. The room looked smaller now, stripped of warmth. The polished wood gleamed under the overhead light, but the reflections felt empty. The chair across from him, her chair, remained untouched, a ghost of a life he once took for granted. He poured himself a drink, the sound of the liquid echoing in the silence. Once, that table had been filled with laughter and arrogance, friends who admired him, a wife who served quietly in the background. Now there was no laughter, no friends, just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of a distant clock. He stared at the chair for a long time, then spoke into the emptiness, his voice cracking. "You win, Clara." But even as he said it, he knew she hadn't been playing to win. She'd been playing to live. To reclaim the pieces of herself he'd spent years convincing her to hide. In the following days, the press continued to praise her, not just for her success, but for the authenticity behind it. They called her the face of a quiet revolution. Her firm announced a mentorship program for women returning to the workforce after long absences. Her story inspired others, women who had once been silenced, underestimated, or overshadowed. Clara didn't just rebuild her world. She opened a door for others to do the same. Ethan watched from the sidelines, unseen, as his name slowly disappeared from relevance. The industry that had once worshipped him now barely mentioned him. His face, once a symbol of ambition, had become a cautionary tale whispered over coffee. Don't be like him, the man who mistook cruelty for strength. Sometimes late at night, he'd walk past the room where the dining table still stood. He could almost hear the echo of that night, the laughter, the clinking glasses, the careless cruelty of his own voice saying, "You're useless." He'd close his eyes and wish he could take it back, but words are arrows. Once released, they never return. And Clara, she had turned that wound into wings. Her call that night hadn't been an act of vengeance. It had been a declaration. A quiet, resolute whisper to the universe that she was ready to be seen again. And the universe had answered. She had reclaimed her story, rebuilt her purpose, and reshaped her destiny with the same grace she once used to endure his contempt. Ethan finally understood what he'd destroyed. Not just a marriage, not just trust, but a woman's belief that she mattered. And when she found that belief again, She no longer needed him to confirm it. The last glass on the table caught the flicker of the lamp, the light bending through the crystal like memory. Ethan lifted it in a silent toast, not to success, not to regret, but to the woman who had taught him far too late that power isn't taken, it's owned. Outside, the city glowed. The same city where her name now opened doors his could no longer enter. And somewhere miles away, Clara Reeves was probably smiling. Not because she'd won, but because she no longer needed to. She hadn't just made a call that changed his life. She had answered one that changed her own.